What's Going On sold 100,000 copies in its first week. The album Gordy called a mistake. The album he refused to release for months. The album that made Motown more money than almost anything they had ever produced. And Marvin Gaye saw almost none of it. That is where this story ends. But the beginning, the part that never makes it into the celebrations, into the anniversary editions, into the documentaries that treat the album's existence as inevitable, the beginning is something else entirely. The beginning is the story of a man inside a machine that had owned him for a decade, deciding for the first time that he was no longer willing to be owned. And the story of what that machine did to him when he made that decision. To understand what Marvin Gaye was up against in 1970, you have to understand what Motown Records actually was. Not the mythology, not the Hitsville, USA sign, not the image of young black talent discovered and elevated by a visionary label. The actual structure, the actual contracts, the actual machinery underneath the music. Gordy founded Motown in 1959 in Detroit, Michigan, with an $800 loan from his family. What he built over the following decade was not simply a record label. It was a vertically integrated system of ownership, a structure in which Motown controlled not just the recordings, but the publishing rights, the management contracts, the touring arrangements, and in many cases, the personal finances of its artists. When a Motown artist made money, Motown made more of it. When a Motown artist spent money on clothes, on travel, on the particular expenses of maintaining a public image the label required them to maintain, they frequently spent money they had already borrowed from Motown against royalties that Motown calculated on their behalf, using accounting methods that the artists themselves were rarely permitted to examine. It was, in the language of the music industry, a development deal. In the language of economic history, it was something closer to a company town. You lived in it. You worked in it. You spent in it. And at the end of every accounting period, you discovered that you owed it more than you had earned. Marvin Gaye had been inside this system since 1961. He had given Motown Stubborn Kind of Fellow, Hitchhike, Pride and Joy, How Sweet It Is, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. He had made the label millions of dollars across nearly a decade of recordings. And by 1970, he was still operating under terms that Gordy's team had negotiated when Marvin was 21 years old, largely unknown, and in no position to refuse anything he was offered. He was also, by 1970, a man in serious pain. His duet partner and closest musical collaborator, Tammy Terrell, had collapsed in his arms on stage at a Virginia college in October 1967. The first visible sign of the brain tumor that would kill her in March 1970. Marvin had watched her deteriorate across 3 years, had visited her in hospitals, had recorded with her when she was too ill to stand without support, had held the weight of her dying while continuing to perform and record as though nothing inside him had broken. Something inside him had broken. People who knew him in that period said the Tammy years changed him in a way that no external success could reach. That he came out of that grief quieter, slower, less interested in the surface of things, and more interested in whatever was underneath. And what was underneath in 1970 was a country on fire. Vietnam was consuming a generation. The civil rights movement had produced legislation, and then watched that legislation fail to reach the actual conditions of Black American life. Martin Luther King had been assassinated in 1968. Robert Kennedy had been assassinated in 1968. Cities had burned. The National Guard had been deployed on American streets. And Motown Records, the label that marketed itself as the sound of young America, was releasing dance records. Carefully crafted, brilliantly produced, meticulously uncommitted dance records. Marvin Gaye decided he was finished with that. The origin of What's Going On is usually traced to a conversation Marvin had with Ronaldo Obi Benson, a member of the Four Tops, who had witnessed the violent police response to a peaceful demonstration in Berkeley, California in 1969. Benson brought the kernel of an idea to Marvin, a song that asked a question instead of answering one. What Marvin did with that kernel was something no one at Motown had anticipated, and no one at Motown, when they finally heard it, knew how to process. He did not write a protest song. He wrote something more dangerous.
Gordy's response has become one of the most documented moments in music industry history. He hated it. Not privately, not reluctantly, openly, emphatically, with the full authority of a man who had built one of the most successful record labels in American history and believed that success had given him an accurate map of what the public wanted. He called What's Going On the worst thing he had ever heard. He told Marvin it was uncommercial, too political, too strange. He said releasing it would damage Marvin's career, the career that Motown had built, the career that existed inside the system Gordy had constructed, the career that, in Gordy's framework, belonged as much to the label as it did to the man. What followed was not a conversation. It was a refusal. Motown declined to release the album. Not indefinitely. There was no formal burial of the project, no official declaration that it would never see the light. Simply a postponement that stretched across months, a series of redirections and delays and suggestions that Marvin return to what had worked before, that he make the record the label needed him to make rather than the record he had already made. Marvin Gaye's response to this refusal is the part of the story that separates it from every other artist versus label dispute of that era. He stopped working. Completely, deliberately, without apology and without negotiation. He told Motown Records, through intermediaries, through direct conversation, in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, that he would not record another note for the label until What's Going On was released. No sessions, no singles, no duets, no holiday recordings, no soundtrack contributions, no contractual obligations of any kind fulfilled. Nothing. Until the album came out. This was not a small threat. Marvin Gaye was, at this point, one of Motown's primary revenue-generating artists. His recordings had been consistent commercial successes for nearly a decade. The prospect of losing his output, even temporarily, represented a real financial cost to the label. And Gordy knew, as all powerful men know when a person beneath them in the hierarchy stops performing fear, that the threat was not entirely about money. It was about precedent. If Marvin Gaye could refuse and survive the refusal,
The architecture of control that Motown had spent a decade constructing became less stable. Every other artist on the roster would be watching. The standoff lasted months. During that time, Marvin did not record. He retreated into a private world of football. He had always harbored serious ambitions as an athlete, a parallel identity that existed entirely outside the Motown system, and music that existed only for himself, in rooms where no one from the label could hear it. He waited, with a patience that people who knew him found remarkable and slightly frightening. The patience of a man who had decided the outcome in advance and was simply allowing time to confirm it. In January 1971, Motown released What's Going On as a single. Without, according to multiple accounts, the full enthusiasm of Gordy, who remained skeptical, who remained convinced he was watching a talented artist make a catastrophic commercial miscalculation. The single sold 100,000 copies in its first week. Gordy called Marvin and told him to finish the album. The full What's Going On album was released in May 1971. It entered the Billboard 200. It became the best-selling album in Motown history to that point. It was reviewed as a masterpiece, not just a good record, not just an important record, but one of the defining artistic achievements in the history of American popular music. Time magazine would eventually name it the greatest album ever made. Rolling Stone placed it at #1 on its list of the 500 greatest albums. Gordy had called it the worst thing he had ever heard. He had been wrong about every single thing. But here is what the celebrations always skip. Here is what gets lost in the anniversary editions and the critical retrospectives and the documentaries that treat the album's triumph as a clean, complete story with a satisfying ending. Marvin Gaye won the fight, and winning cost him everything. The royalty structure on What's Going On, the actual financial terms under which the best-selling album in Motown history generated income for its creator, reflected the contract Marvin had signed in 1961. A contract negotiated when he was unknown, when he had no leverage, when he did not yet understand what leverage was or that he would one day possess it. The album that changed American music generated enormous wealth. The man who made it received a fraction of what those terms entitled him to. Under accounting practices he was not empowered to audit. The publishing rights, the most durable, most valuable form of music ownership, the rights that generate income every time a song is played, licensed, covered, or used, belonged largely to Motown. Marvin had signed them away, as virtually every Motown artist had signed them away, in the early years when the label's boilerplate contracts were presented as standard and non-negotiable. What's Going On would generate publishing income for decades. Most of that income did not go to Marvin Gaye. And the personal cost, the cost inside the building, inside the relationships, inside the power structure of the label, was immediate and lasting. Gordy did not forget the standoff. Men who have built systems of control do not forget the moments when those systems are tested and found insufficient. The relationship between Gordy and Gaye, already complicated by the fact that Marvin was married to Gordy's sister, Anna, shifted in 1971 into something colder and more transactional. The creative support, the promotional investment, the institutional weight of the label behind an artist's work, these things are never distributed equally. And after What's Going On, they were distributed to Marvin Gaye with a visible reduction in warmth. There is a version of this story that ends with Marvin Gaye's triumph and asks nothing further. The artist versus the institution, the visionary versus the businessman, the music that changed everything, released against the wishes of the people who owned it. It is a satisfying story. It is also incomplete. What the full story requires is a reckoning with what Motown actually was, and what it did to the people inside it, including the people it made famous. Gordy was not a villain in the simple sense. He was a black entrepreneur who built something extraordinary in a country that offered black entrepreneurs almost nothing. No institutional backing, no financial infrastructure, no protection from the specific hostilities of white-owned industries that did not want them to succeed. What he built at Motown was real. The careers he created were real. The music was real. And the system he used to build it, the contracts, the ownership structures, the financial arrangements that kept artists dependent and label profits growing, that was also real. It did not exist in spite of what Motown was. It existed because of what Motown was. The two things cannot be separated, and the story that only tells half of them is not telling the truth. Marvin Gaye understood this better than almost anyone. He had lived inside the system long enough to understand its architecture, to feel the weight of it in his royalty statements, in his recording obligations, in the gap between what his music earned and what he was permitted to keep. What's Going On was not just an artistic statement about Vietnam and poverty and a country in crisis. It was also the sound of a man testing the walls of the room he had been living in, pressing against them, for the first time, with his full weight. The walls held. They bent slightly in the direction of the music, but they held. After What's Going On, Marvin made Let's Get It On. He made I Want You. He made Here, My Dear, the devastating double album he recorded as an act of financial self-destruction required by his divorce settlement with Gordy, an album he made with a kind of bitter brilliance that bordered on self-immolation. Each record a masterpiece. Each record produced within a system that was still extracting more than it was returning. He left Motown in 1982. He signed with Columbia Records. He recorded Sexual Healing in Belgium and watched it become one of the biggest hits of his career. For a moment, for one extended, fragile moment, it looked like the ending might be different from the one the system had been building toward. It was not. The IRS debt that had accumulated across the Motown years, the result of the gap between what Marvin earned and what he actually received, compounded by the financial decisions of a man who had never been taught to manage money because the system he worked inside preferred him not to, followed him to Belgium, followed him back to Los Angeles, followed him into the house on Gramercy Place where the final chapter was already being written. What's Going On asked a question in 1971 that the music industry did not answer. It asked what was happening to the country, to its cities, to its young men sent to die in foreign wars. But underneath that question was another one, quieter, more personal, more dangerous. What is happening inside this building? Inside these contracts? Inside the machinery that takes a man's voice and sells it back to him as a product he no longer owns? Gordy answered that question the only way institutions answer questions that threaten them. He absorbed it. He let the album come out. He took the money it made. He adjusted nothing fundamental about the system that had produced the conditions Marvin was singing about. And then he wept at the funeral. in front of cameras.
The album still plays. Every year, in every crisis, in every moment when the country finds itself asking the same questions it was asking in 1971, someone puts on "What's Going On?" and the room goes quiet. Because Marvin Gaye made something that does not age. Something that reached past the specific year it was made and touched something permanent about what it means to live inside systems that were not built to protect you. He won the fight that mattered and lost almost everything else. He made the music that lasts forever and held almost none of the rights to it. He asked the question the world needed to hear and spent the rest of his life paying for having asked it. That is what Motown tried to kill in 1970. Not just an album. A man who had decided, for the first time, at the cost of everything, to tell the truth about what's going on. What's really going on. Now you know.